interest to prevent excessive borrowing, even as we can only maintain a vital circulation by reborrowing higher sums of interest, then increasing the sum of indebtedness at a faster rate on a faster course to terminal failure. So we see Griffin supporting Ron Paul as recently as the 2008 presidential elections. He'd appeared on YouTube videos with Ron Paul and explaining Austrian economics and, advocating interest all the while. Now what kind of expert is Griffin suddenly in eradicating interest? And why did he shift to the opposite pole? That's the question. Why? Because people in why am I going here? Because people in other countries are listening to weigh alternate propositions of solution, and Griffin's would be one of them, ostensibly. But why has Griffin shifted to the opposite pole? Because of an article I wrote about him. So let's look at this article a minute. Title of it is Invalidation. It's dated May 31, 2008. In other words, it dates, and if I recall correctly, I wrote it in response to a YouTube video in which he's, advocated interest and whatnot, and then I discovered in a Daily Paul thread that some further things that Griffin had written, and I respond to them in Invalidation. So the title of this is Invalidation of G. Edward Griffin's Creature from Jekyll Island Obfuscation of the Need to Reborrow Interest to Maintain a Circulation. In other words, Griffin's denying that interest multiplies artificial indebtedness in proportion to a circulation or remaining capacity to pay. So, my article begins. After tracing site traffic to a Daily Paul forum thread started by a fellow who goes by the handle of Shovelhead, the kind of misunderstandings on which a republic will perish begged response to G. Edward Griffin's Creature from Jekyll Island obfuscation of the need to reborrow interest to maintain a circulation. Griffin denies that interest multiplies debt in proportion to a circulation or remaining capacity to pay. From Griffin's suspicious twist, and even as debt continues to multiply in proportion to the circulation or our capacity to service debt, forum participants had drawn faulty conclusions either that it is impossible to perfect economy or that it is not even necessary to solve inherent multiplication of debt by interest. To Mr. Shovelhead's credit, he could not concur in the other reader's unqualifiable deductions. But the obvious expense of Griffin's resultant confusion, therefore, is collapse under untended further multiplication of insoluble debt, unless Mr. Griffin's reassurance that no such problem exists holds water. You remember me reading you a paper against William B. Ryan the other day. Same arguments here. An Austrian argument, evidently. Even if Griffin's intended point were true, however, it provides no foundation whatever to rightly deduce that it is impossible to perfect economy, or that mathematically perfected economy does not solve the breadth of monetary improprieties observed by others, and assumably even by Mr. Griffin himself. For he wrote a book ostensibly against an entity, the only imposed process of which is interest. But it is in fact impossible for Griffin's irresponsible obfuscation to represent the whole quantified cycle of interest as it would have to if his deception were to certify the impression he wants you to take from it. Griffin's obfuscation instead is limited to the mere idea that one of the issues solved by mathematically perfected economy does not exist. The promise Griffin hopes an unthinking readership to assimilate is that it is not even necessary or right to perfect an economy of multiplication of debt by interest, even as every debt subject to interest is multiplied even in its initial case by interest. And as perpetual multiplication suffered merely in maintaining a circulation, certainly would result in collapse and even the terminal conditions mounting everywhere around us. We, of course, then, cannot afford to underestimate or misunderstand the latter potential issue of inherent, irreversible, and terminal multiplication of debt in proportion to a circulation by interest. But Griffin's attempts to refute just this proposition only, by providing an example which cannot possibly account for multiplication of debt across a whole system subject to interest. And if, in fact, to accomplish the purpose of invalidation, all those who deny the proposition of this terminal imperfection must demonstrate that no interest whatever is reborrowed as would inherently increase the sum of debt in proportion to a circulation. Thus, Griffin's obfuscation must account for every cent of interest paid out of the general circulation, something which we shall soon see is obviously impossible. The next subtitle of this article, then, it cites Griffin's explanation, and I've called this subsection "The Pledge of G. Edward Griffin's Creature from Jekyll Island." And I introduce it with one short paragraph. Rather than answering the issues raised in the Principles of Mathematically Perfected Economy, Griffin simply invents and answers his own questions, ostensibly intending to invalidate the fact of inherent, perpetual, irreversible, and terminal multiplication of debt in proportion to a circulation, which obviously would be solved by the third aspect of mathematically perfected economy. Even rather than to attack the obvious solution, he purposely further refrains from answering for the whole quantities by which interest multiplies debt in proportion to a circulation. So I quote Griffin here. He says, "One of the most perplexing questions associated with this process is one, where does the money come from to pay the interest? If you borrow $10,000, and I'm going to stop right here. All these plagiarists, act like it's completely obvious that, to understand that interest inherently multiplies debt in proportion to a vital circulation now, and none of them have ever done the math. None of them have ever written a computer model that accounts for this whole thing, even so far back as 1983 and 4, to project that this so-called economy would collapse in the year 2010. So you see this in literally millions, just millions and millions of pages, just in regard to the one article, that I cited the other day, my Parable of Perfect Economy, and then Franklin's, paper, Modest Inquiry to the Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency. We found 25,400,000 articles in regard to that now, as if this idea of interest is obvious. But here you find what I have fought against all this time. They didn't think it was obvious at all. In fact, here you have a man's arguments that are trying to say that no, that guy's totally wrong on this, okay? And this is probably not a leading Austrian economist, if there is such a thing, but he's a well-known author. He used to have a TV program, Anyway, he goes on, and this is an example of this isn't obvious at all. Ellen Hodgson Brown didn't figure this out and then try and preserve interest by introducing it with the principle, because you figure out in this process that interest is wrong, you see. So it's not obvious at all, and yet she just plagiarizes me, and all these other people, of course, do as well. So, backing up here, one of the most perplexing questions associated with this process is one, where does the money come from to pay the interest? If you borrow $10,000 from a bank at 9%, you owe $10,900. Well, in a year, but the period of the loan matters. But the bank only manufactures $10,000 for the loan. 2, it would seem, and these numbers are I'm referred to these points in further discussion here. 2, it would seem, therefore, that there is no way that you and all others with similar loans can possibly pay off your indebtedness. In other words, he's assuming that you can, out of the circulation. Okay? Now, listen to his explanation for this when we get to this, though. The amount of money put into circulation just isn't enough to cover the total debt. He's saying it is, including interest. 3, this has led some to the conclusion that it is necessary for you to borrow the $900 for the interest, and that, in turn, leads to still more interest. The assumption... So what did he say? He says, this has led some to the conclusion. Okay, well... anyway, he says the assumption is, in other words, that's just an assumption. Here I've produced these models for the Reagan administration, which use that assumption to calculate from 1983 and 4 exactly how much debt we would accumulate to now, and when we would get to a point of terminal failure. And it's just an assumption. Very interesting. How else would you account for that? Of course, Austrian economists, remember, they denounce all application of math. So no matter the quality of the math, it just doesn't count somehow. So he's doing this without math, but he's trying to give us math. So that's how hypocritical Austrian economy, so-called, is. So anyway, he says, and that in turn leads to still more interest. The assumption is that the more we borrow, the more we have to borrow, and the debt based on fiat money is a never-ending spiral leading inexorably to more and more debt. That's just an assumption. Okay, so he says this is a partial truth. It is true that there is not enough money to created to include the interest, 5, but it is a fallacy that the only way to pay it back is to borrow still more. 6, the assumption fails to take into account the exchange value of labor. This is, the exchange value of labor. Excuse me, you will find in the rest of this that this, Austrians are always throwing this back at us, the exchange value of labor or the time aspect of money, as if they understand something that we don't understand, that it counts for this, but they can't even explain. And you'll see he doesn't explain it here. The exchange value of labor. Let us assume that you pay back your $10,000 loan at the rate of approximately $900 per month, and that about $80 of that represents interest. You realize you are hard-pressed to make your payments, so you decide to take on a part-time job. Oh, you're going to work harder now to pay the interest. The bank, on the other hand, is now making an $80 profit each month on your loan. Since this amount is classified as interest, it is not extinguished, as is the larger portion, which is a return of the loan itself. I don't know what he means by using the word extinguished, because it's certainly, not extinguished. So this remains as spendable money in the account of the bank. The decision then is made to have the bank's floors waxed once a week. You respond to the ad in the paper and are hired at $80 per month to do the job. As if we are all can work for the banks, and the banks can consume all the interest that we ever pay out of circulation in order to reintroduce it to circulation without us having to reborrow it. 1 penny escapes